Greetings, everyone. I hope you are all well. Couple of announcements to make before we get started tonight. I wanted to give a big shout out and thank you to the members of Back to Ashes. If you would like to become a member, please hit that join button. It's only $2 a month. Every little bit helps this channel. And on top of that, you become a member with extra privileges. I've also linked a Buy Me a Coffee down below. If you would like to buy me a coffee, if you enjoy the content that you are hearing, I would appreciate it as it helps so much. Also, my merch store is now up and running. If you would like to grab some merch for the Back to Ashes channel, that is also linked below. With that being said, it is time to go back to ashes. For when we arise from the ashes, we are a stronger, better, and happier person. Now, please enjoy these true backwoods creepy stories set to the ambiance of crackling fire. In December of 2005, me and a few high school friends were back home from our respective universities. We were juniors at the time and started a tradition winter break of freshman year to visit random state parks and smaller towns to explore them, along with the occasional mischief that we would end up getting ourselves into. During these one-night trips, the three of us would all sleep in the back of my Tahoe on a large mattress pad. This kept us safe from the elements and set my paranoid mind at ease should we be subject to any foul play. We decided this year to go to the Davy Crockett National Forest area. This area has many places that are extremely rural and desolate, which was exciting because we had previously found some interesting things in abandoned structures on our previous excursions. I had used up the rest of my university printing credits to print detailed MapQuest pages for us to use for navigation while we were visiting. The drive was roughly 2 hours from our hometown, Conroe. We decided to start the trip off in Lufkin, just east of the National Forest, to eat dinner and get a few things from Walmart. After dinner, we decided to mess around and get into our shenanigans. A few hours later, we found ourselves in Crockett, Texas, about an hour west of Lufkin. We planned on staying in a campground about halfway between the two cities, so had a lot of flexibility when it came to time. We explored random roads and went in a few abandoned buildings before getting bored and wanting to go somewhere else. By this time, it was 12:30 a.m. At this point in the night, I needed an energy boost, so decided to stop at a gas station in Kennard, Texas, which was about 30 minutes east of Crockett. I go inside and buy a few drinks, energy drinks and a few cans of Skull to give us some fuel for the rest of the night. With a nice buzz from the energy drink and Skull going, we decided to get a little more adventurous and venture down FM 357 south of Kennard. We came across a few Forest Service roads that ventured off into rural residential roads and other country roads. I pulled off on the side of the road to check MapQuest and match the cross streets we were at and give it to my other two friends to assist with navigation. After getting back onto the road, I notice it is 1:30 a.m. and we all joke about how we are miraculously still awake. I decided to head down the next service road we came across. This is where things start to get pretty weird, and where parts of my memory are erased due to the sheer adrenaline I had at the time. After driving down a few more service roads and taking random turns, we get to a road that is much more narrow compared to the others. By this time, I get incredibly frustrated because it is almost 2:15 a.m. and I don't want to stumble into someone's front yard in a rural area in the middle of the night. I decided to slowly proceed down the road when suddenly I noticed a faint light in the distance. Great, I thought. Just great. I'm about to spook some random poor soul awake. About 30 minutes later, I can tell these are headlights, but they suddenly disappeared. I thought someone may have turned up ahead, but I was very wrong. About 10 to 15 seconds later, I see what appeared to be a brand new black Chevy Suburban. The second I put my high beams on it, its lights turned on, and 3 men dressed in full suits jump out and sprint down the road past my car. It was almost like they were lifeless. They didn't even look at my car. As they were running past me, the Suburban suddenly shifts into reverse and conducts the fastest reverse maneuver I have ever seen. At this point, I unholster my G26 and tell my friends to grab my AR. We were all scared shitless, and I had zero clue what we were about to come up on as we drove forward. Mind you, these were the days where cell phone coverage was non-existent in many areas of this region of the state, so we had no way to call for help if something happened. As we reached the end of the road, we came upon FM 357, the same road we originated from. How was this possible? I thought. I felt like we were just venturing further and further away from that road, and we passed a U.S. Forest Service fire station again, on the way out, like we had on the way in, too. I recently checked Google Maps for any U.S. Forest Service fire station off of FM 357 and cannot find any current or past historical data on it. The county tax assessor does not have any listings either. We got back on FM 357 and decided to book it to downtown Crockett, as we did not feel comfortable with sleeping in a campsite after what had just happened. I have since made sure to never venture down unknown roads without referencing GPS or maps. I am still processing that short but unsettling event. Where did those men come from? Why were they in suits in the middle of the forest? Where did the black Suburban go that vanished into the night? Me and my friends still occasionally talk about this incident, and no one can seem to come up with a found explanation. The thing that bothers me the most is I cannot find any evidence of this road we were on. Google Earth software doesn't even have a road or satellite imagery that lines up with what happened. Nor does it have evidence of a fire station, or any structure for that matter. Just today, my friend and I were hiking on some abandoned and unused land. It's really beautiful with lakes, cliffs, and tons of trees. The hike was going really well, but close to dark, it turned around. My friend whispered to me that they had been thinking of skinwalkers and couldn't stop. This got me thinking of the same, and we decided to head back to the car to eliminate any risk. A few minutes into the hike back, we both got a horrible feeling, and it became apparent that we were not alone. We kept making our way back to the car as fast as we could, but it kept getting worse. Both of us experienced blur vision, and the air suddenly got thick and had a hum to it. It also became incredibly hard to move, and we both experienced an intense urge to lay down and stop hiking. We came across an area we hadn't yet hiked through, but was adjacent to there we were. And there were so many deer prints in every direction, as if a deer had been rapidly pacing there and human footprints on the other side of that scramble. There wasn't a clear starting point to the footprints and no evidence of other hikers for miles. The trek back to the car seemed to take 5 minutes and 3 hours simultaneously, so we have no clue how long it took. Neither of us felt this sense of dread or been this disoriented before. Do you think we had a close encounter with a skinwalker, or was it something else entirely? I do not have the background knowledge to say what exactly it could be. We are in eastern Kansas, if that helps. Any information or ideas are appreciated. Quick note, I am not trying to offend anyone in my story. I am simply telling the events that I experienced. My friend was thinking of skinwalkers, and I am simply looking for advice or ideas as to what I could have experienced. Whatever it was very scary and not a good experience. I said in my story that I did not have the knowledge or experience to claim it to be anything specific, and I hoped that doing so would clarify that I was not trying to offend anyone. Thank you all who could provide information as to what this was. I really appreciate it. So, this story begins like this. A friend and I were over a week ago, on the 29th of December 2022 to be exact, out in town, and later that night we drove up to the forest, about a mile up the hill and away from my house. It was around 9 p.m. when we arrived up there. A very strange night, to be honest. The moon was visible behind the clouds and everything was really dark. We pretty much were standing for around 10 minutes next to my car, in the darkness, looking into the forest, having a smoke break. Then, the forest got more quiet after a guy with a dog came by. Nothing unusual. Well, till I got even more quiet. I then spotted some weird lights in the forest, probably half a mile up to a mile inside. Between the trees, it looked like candlelight. By the way, we didn't have any snow by then for about a week or two. I told my friend and pointed over to the lights. They just shrugged it off and told me that it was that clear. It could be a house in the distance, but it wasn't. I knew that for a fact. There was no house. Just one further up the road, not over there in that forest. I knew that forest well, after all. We were looking and watching for a bit, until a weird feeling hit us, like we were being watched by something. Hearing some leaves rattle and some branches cracking a bit. Elsewise, those lights looked like they were coming closer. I can swear, I might have heard some voice from where those lights were as well, but I'm not sure. After finishing the smoke break, we got back into the car, since it felt way too eerie. I even stared over and just said, "No worries, we're just visiting and came in peace. I know you are out there." My friend just glared at me, like I was a madman, knowing that at least one wendigo and some other beings roamed around this particular forest. I told him the stories, by the way. Well, nothing eventful afterwards until I went to bed that following night. I had a strange dream, very lucid. I would say astral again for what it's worth. In the dream, I was going close to the forest, looking down where that swamp was. It was a bright afternoon, middle of the winter. Snow was almost covering everything. It looked similar like these other dreams, in which a wendigo, which I know quite well now, visited me. Speaking of, there was one, not the one I knew, this one. This one was different, looking like a bear skeleton with a skull, a big skull which looked strange, having antlers and a half skeleton and rotten like corpse as a body. I stared at it. It looked at me and howled at me. The sound was deafening, and I only heard you know the sound after something loud, like an explosion? It was like that, with white noise and static in my vision. A moment later, I was awake, looking around, saying only, "What the F was that?" I then turned around and went to sleep again. I fell asleep and woke up in the same dream, just down there, facing this wendigo. I was mad, just mad as hell for letting out this screech or howl. The next thing I remember was me bolting towards it, bearing some ungodly wrath, ramming my fist into its rib cage and tearing out its heart. Moments later, I saw him fall apart, letting out a screech, holding his bloody, ice-cold heart in my hand. The following part was more and less fuzzy, not sure did I or didn't I. Did I eat his heart? Later woke up and that was pretty much it. I'll keep this short and sweet. A few years back, we were having a brutally cold winter. The snow had frozen into ice and covered everything. It was pitch black in the backyard when I went to let my dogs outside one last time before bed that evening. When we exited the house from the sliding door of the walkout basement and onto the lower deck, I felt that something was off. Our house backs up to some woods, so I was accustomed to hearing noises from wildlife in the night. This night was different. Nothing made a sound except the Arctic cold wind, but I had the feeling I was being watched. The entire time, my dog was in the backyard. I looked around nervously, expecting a coyote or other predator to pop out of the tree line. My dog did his business, but afterwards stopped and stared at the corner of the woods until I got creeped out and called him back inside. I quickly locked the sliding door and shut the curtains, unable to shake the uneasy feeling I had outside. After double and triple checking all the locks in the house, I went to bed. Around 3 a.m, I heard the muffled sound of my dog barking from the basement 2 floors below. I got up, stumbled down 3 flights of stairs, and found him standing at the basement sliding door. He was peeking his head through the closed curtains, barking his head off with the hair standing up along his neck. I tried calling him away from the door, but he wouldn't let up. I dreaded peeking out the curtain to see what he was barking at after the uneasy feeling I had earlier in the night. Finally, I held my breath and swiped the curtain aside. I peered into the inky blackness, but saw nothing to cause any alarm. A wave of relief washed over me. I figured it must have been a deer or raccoon in the yard that set him off. He whined at the door for a few more minutes until I bribed him upstairs with a dog cookie. I went back to bed and wasn't disturbed again. That is, until the morning when I went to the basement to let my dog out. I opened the sliding door and walked out onto the deck as he bounded into the snow. My blood ran as cold as the sub-zero morning temperatures when I looked down. There, frozen into the ice on the deck, was a set of bare, human footprints. They were very clear. I could make out each toe on the person's foot. The prints were large and appeared to be from an adult male. Looking around, I noticed they started at the base of the deck, went to the sliding door and the window of the basement living room, then seemed to disappear off the side of the deck. I had my snow boots on, so I walked around the yard, but I could find no trace of the footprints in the snow once they left the deck. Keep in mind, the daily temperatures that winter barely made it above zero, and the wind chill made it feel close to 20 below. Frostbite would set in within a matter of minutes for anyone walking around barefoot, especially in the dead of the night. I never experienced anything like that again, but I did adopt a second dog shortly thereafter, just to be safe. The summer of 2008 was a rough time to graduate from college. I had just spent 4 years getting a degree, only to find that the job market had all but dried up. As bummed out as I was about being unemployed for the foreseeable future, I found a deep appreciation for backcountry camping and hiking that summer. Growing up in the Rocky Mountains and graduating from a college in western Montana, I was not a stranger to hiking or camping. But that summer it became an escape to the point of an obsession. Going on daily hikes and camping beneath the stars really helped my mental health while I worried about my life's purpose and my future. It was June and unseasonably cold, wet, and cloudy. The daytime highs barely touched 50 degrees, and at night it dropped below freezing. Despite the weather, I had planned to hike around the Anaconda Range that week, and I wasn't going to let that deter me. My plan for the week, funny enough, was to hike from Storm Lake over Storm Lake Pass and down to Upper Seymour Lake. Storm Lake, actually an alpine reservoir, is a challenge to get to and requires a 4x4 pickup and some skilled driving. The road is a narrow 2-track winding its way through thick pine forests. The way was slick with rain, but I made it to the top with a little heartburn. I set up camp on the north shore of the lake and decided to do some fishing. The fishing was miserable. It was cold and nothing was biting. But the best thing about bad fishing is that my thoughts were free to wander while I sat on the shore. The rain was a constant light drizzle and created a natural white noise. Time passed and my daydreams were cut short as a low rumble from up the canyon overtook the sounds of the rain. The rumbling was not unlike a distant diesel engine. There are no roads that go beyond where I was camped. No machinery or vehicle could be up on that canyon. Maybe it's a plane, I thought, looking up into the rain clouds. But the sound wasn't getting closer or further away, and the sound wasn't above me. It came from beyond the lake and up into the canyon. The sound was stationary and constant. This was most certainly not a plane, or truck, or bulldozer. All of this wasn't outright scary, but nonetheless, my hair stood on end while I sat there listening. After 20 minutes, the rumbling faded away and I was left again with only the sound of raindrops. Soon enough, I caught a decent-sized trout, cleaned it, and headed back to camp to get ready for dinner. The fish cooked up fine, but to be honest, I hate trout. It's edible, sure, but totally unappetizing. They taste like mud. I ate as much as I could stand and tossed the rest into the lake. Building up my fire for the night, I sat back to enjoy the evening with a bit of whiskey. Night came fast. The mountain ridges put the sun to bed early, and the rain clouds obscured the starlight. It was dark, and I do mean really dark. The sound of a crackling warm fire and the rain bouncing off my tent were a great comfort and started to lull me to sleep. I reminded myself I needed to build up the fire before bed. I walked over to my pile of scavenged firewood and grabbed an armful. Being away from the fire's crackling, I could pick up that all too familiar rumbling rising in the background. It was growing louder than before, and closer. I may have had a few too many pulls of whiskey and was tired and grouchy. This noise was ruining my camping trip and my buzz. Frustrated, I yelled into the blackness of the night, "Hey, shut the F up, a-hole." Like a switch being flipped, the rumbling stopped, and so did the rain. My heart skipped a beat. I realized that was not a convenient coincidence. There was an intelligence out there, something sentient, observing me and responding to my screams, and I wasn't getting the most positive vibes from it. I threw all the logs on the fire and retreated back to my tent. More on edge than ever, I just sat there, listening to the fire crackling, to my rapid breathing, and beyond that, to the silence of the darkness. Before this moment, I had felt alone but safe. Now I felt alone and vulnerable. Beyond where the firelight faded, I felt there were a million eyes in that dark watching me. My paranoia began to subside when the rain suddenly started again. Not a drizzle, but a massive downpour. I was glad I had built up the fire, or it would have been snuffed out for sure. My tent was being pushed down by the force of the storm. I thought about bailing to the truck, but knew I'd be soaked to the bone instantly. Risking injury or death over getting wet is the kind of logic only whiskey can produce. I could feel the rainwater pooling and moving under my tent. This storm was not letting up. The urge to get in the pickup truck and drive away was ever more tantalizing. I could get my stuff tomorrow in the daylight and spend a few nights in town, but I'd had a bit too much to drink. Driving, especially on that slick, muddy 2-track road, would have been a death sentence, but I needed a safer place to sleep than a wimpy tent. Grabbing what I could, I ripped open the tent flaps and ran for the truck. I was soaking wet by the time I settled into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Turning the heat on full blast, I hoped that would dry me out. It was going to be a miserable night, though. I reclined my chair and tried to calm my thoughts with deep breaths. The rain wasn't letting up. I was warm from the heater, and I was riding the crest of a good whiskey buzz. The fire was still raging despite the rain and kept the campsite well lit. I remember the truck's clock reading 1:06 a.m. I blinked. It was only a moment, but when I opened my eyes, the rain had stopped. It was foggy and eerily quiet. The once raging campfire was just embers, and there was morning twilight to the east. The truck's clock now read 5:45 a.m. It was morning. That couldn't be right. Almost 5 hours gone in the blink of an eye. I must have passed out. My head was killing me. I didn't feel like I had drank that much to justify that kind of hangover. I turned off the truck and stepped out to survey the night's damage. My tent was completely flattened. The tent poles were shattered to pieces. Everything was soaking wet. Smothering the remains of the fire, I dragged all my junk to the pickup and tossed it into the bed. My hike over the pass wasn't happening today, that was for sure. It was around 6:30 a.m. before I finished packing up my camp. As I climbed into the cab of my truck, I heard the rumbling again through the morning fog. I drove out of there as fast as I could down that muddy, bobsled track of a road, not once looking into the rearview mirror. Not once. I have never been back to Storm Lake, and I probably never will. I was in my last year before retiring from the Army and was going through a divorce. My soon-to-be ex went back to Texas with my 2 girls, and I planned to move closer to them once my retirement was official. I rented a small 2-bedroom in Tennessee in a town called Indian Mound. Indian Mound was out of the way and really isolated. My commute sucked, but it was cheap and peaceful. I had no neighbors. Across the street was all conservation land for miles. On one side and around the back of the property was a swamp. On the other side, the closest house was out of shouting distance. I enjoyed living there initially. Before this, I lived in the suburbs, and all the noise, people, and traffic drove me crazy. One night, I came home around 1 a.m. from a concert in Nashville. It was early spring, and it was somewhat foggy out. The driveway dipped down, and the house was about an 1/8 mile from the road. As I pulled in, I saw a huge black dog standing in the front yard. Looked like a black lab or lab mixed breed. It stood with its head up and its tail straight up. It was fixed on me. I slowly pulled my car up, unsure what to do next, when it turned and ran into the swamp. I didn't think much of it and went inside. Over the following few months, things started happening at night. I would always wake up around 3 or so in the morning, thinking I heard voices outside my window. And sometimes it sounded like someone, or a couple of people were whispering to each other, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. Sometimes I could hear footsteps and movement outside. I thought it was maybe a deer or that dog, but when I looked out, I saw nothing. This type of shit continued for months. One night, I woke up to a noise and saw it was 2:57 a.m. A bright white light shone through the porch glass doors. I ran out into the kitchen and looked through the small sink window, and it looked like someone was out in the swamp shining a spotlight. It was one of those high-powered lights used in search and rescue. It was blinding and lit up the whole kitchen. I opened the back doors and ran out onto the porch, yelling I was calling the cops. The light went out, and I heard someone moving away from the house through the swamp. Cops came out and took a report and told me to ensure my doors were locked and to call if anything else happened. I was hyper-vigilant for the next few days. I checked behind me when I was coming and going and always slept with the shades drawn and doors locked. The footsteps around the house continued, and some nights I thought I could hear a dog panting outside my window, although I never found tracks or saw signs of an animal in the morning. Things died down after a while, and I was about 3 months away from the end of my lease. I woke up around 3 in the morning, scared out of my mind. I was sleeping and heard a woman calling my name in my dream. I opened my eyes and realized it was a dream when I heard the voice call my name, again, clear as day. I shot up out of bed and turned on the lights. I checked in the closet and under the bed. I opened the bedroom door and listened out in the hallway. I couldn't hear anything and was about to cut the lights and go back to bed when someone started pounding on my front door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was like someone was bashing the door with a sledgehammer. I yelled out that I had a gun and get the F off my property. I said I called the cops and I'll blow your effing head off before they get here. The pounding immediately stopped. Cops came out again and took another report. There was no visible damage to the door or footprints around the property. It all just stopped after that. I did buy a 9mm, but the rest of my time renting there was without incident. I'm back in Texas, in an apartment complex in the burbs, and I don't mind. The backwoods of Tennessee were a creepy place, and I will never be visiting those again. I work as a child care professional, and one of the kids that I look after had recently gotten into hiking. I decided to take him to a really cool trail in Salt Fork State Park. We were all set to hike to Hossack's Cave after parking right near the beginning of the trailhead. The entire trail is about a half of a mile, which is why I chose this trail for our hike that day. I also chose this trail because any time that I had been on it before, it was very busy and full of people, and a very popular spot which made me feel secure. However, this past summer, we had a cluster of severe summer storms which caused massive damage to the trail. So, to my surprise, it was much more difficult and completely empty. I wasn't bothered by the trail being obviously empty because there was a small construction crew working on a bridge that was just barely visible from the trailhead. He was still up for the hike, despite the entire width of the trail being washed out until it was no more than a foot wide, with a 6 to 12 foot drop off into a creek bed that is solid rock and several trees down. He is very athletic, and I was confident in his abilities if he was, and he was so excited to tackle our adventure. We made it all the way to a platform that allows you to see the entire cave. There were many downed trees surrounding the platform, and it was actually closed at this point, but we had made it this far, so we decided to maneuver around the platform and proceeded the few hundred feet into the cave. We spent the most time in this area due to the difficulty, so I know exactly what it looked like. There were tree roots directly under the platform, and you could climb down either side of them. It is also worth noting that Hossack's Cave is much more than a cliff with an overhanging rock formation and a trickle of a waterfall directly in the middle. It is not a creepy closed-up cave. It is very open and beautiful. We got to the cave and I noticed a candle that was not burning recently but had been at some point sitting on a large rock that had a heart carved into it. I chalked it up to someone having a date or something and disregarded it. He wanted to climb to the top, where I noticed 2 more candles and 3 stacks of small rocks that had been stacked up by somebody. I definitely felt weird at this point, but it was about this time that he found a small puddle full of baby salamanders and wanted to catch them. It was the happiest that I had seen him in a very long time, and I didn't have the heart to tell him that it was time to go. We spent an hour catching baby salamanders, and I watched him have the time of his life. We finally decided to leave, and when we got to the platform, dead center in the middle of the tree roots was a wet washcloth hanging that was absolutely not there before. He noticed it as well, but did not pick up on the severity of the situation that we were in. At that moment, I factually knew two things. One, someone was watching us and we did not see them. And two, they were now potentially hiding in the woods and made it to a point to not be seen, but to leave an object to be noticed. There was no running back with the narrow trail, and I was not about to tell him that we were in potential danger. I told him to go in front of me, and I just kept encouraging him that he was doing great over and over, and that seemed to speed him up naturally. I never saw anyone while we were on the trail. We got to the car, and I locked the doors immediately. On our way out of the park, a very dirty man, probably in his 30s, came out of the woods and made it a point to stare at me with the most empty of expressions that I have ever seen. The man followed me with his eyes and head as I drove by him and continued to stare at me until I couldn't see him anymore. I knew the third fact at that point. He made it to a point to make himself apparent to me, and that facts 1 and 2 were true. That stare stuck with me for days, and I considered counseling after this, as it bothered me for several weeks, causing me severe anxiety. I tried to tell myself that maybe we just interrupted his bath time, and he was camping and didn't want to startle us. After all, the crazy-looking man had ample time to do anything that he wanted while we were catching salamanders. I just could not in any way rationalize why he stared into my eyes the way that he did if he wanted to go unnoticed. Deep down, I know that it is much more likely that it was a deliberate action intended to scare me. He never had any idea how panicked I was, and to this day, it's the most fun that I have ever seen him have. He brings it up regularly, and it was a very positive experience for him. It was one of the worst experiences ever, and it made me feel so sick and disturbed. I will not be visiting that place ever again. This was a few years ago. It was pretty late, past 1:30/2 in the morning. I was living with this boy who was pretty abusive, and he had gotten really jealous at this party we were at earlier that night. Not even an hour after we had gotten home, he tossed me out onto our front porch and locked the door behind me. I was knocking and pleading for him to please let me back inside. I was still wearing what I had worn to the party, and it was freezing out. I wasn't sure what to do. He had my phone, purse, and wallet in the house with him, so I just sat on the porch crying. When he turned off the light, both inside and outside of the house, I knew he wasn't going to let me back in. I felt so helpless and cold. I thought about knocking on a neighbor's door, though he didn't have many, but I had anxiety about waking any of them up and causing trouble for my boyfriend. So, instead, I decided I would try to walk to this gas station and motel, which was like a little less than a mile away, so I could use their phone and try to call a girlfriend of mine to see if I could sleep over with her. Ironically enough, the road I was walking, Donner Pass Road, was freezing cold, so it was fitting. But anyway, a little bit into the walk, this tall white pickup truck was approaching on the opposite side of the road that I was on. I tried not to make eye contact for obvious reasons, but then I heard the truck stopping and beginning to make a U-turn, and my heart just started pounding. I just about froze up, but forced myself to speed walk at the very least. The truck pulled up to me, and this guy rolled down his window and asked what I was doing out this late. I told him how I was going to meet my friend at the gas station and that she was expecting me. He sort of smiled and offered me a ride. I said no thank you, citing that I shouldn't hitchhike. He told me, "Well, good. I don't pick up hitchhikers or anyone. You don't look like a hitchhiker, though. You just look like you need some help." He just kept driving next to me and told me I shouldn't think he was a creep, and he pulled out what looked like a police badge and told me he had just gotten off duty, which is why he was in civilian clothes and out so late. He said he wouldn't mind driving next to me just to make sure I get to where I was heading safely. I was naive and a bit too trusting of his kindness and credentials, and when he offered me a ride again, I said that it would be nice because the gas station wasn't that far away anyway. He popped the door open for me and I hopped in. The radio was low. It was a little messy. The ashtray was full of cigarettes. There were a lot of newspapers on the passenger floor. As I was moving my feet, some of the papers shifted, showing a pair of handcuffs, some coffee cups, empty water bottles, rags, a highlight-colored bandana, and some other things. He apologized, saying that it was the truck he took hunting, but it was super warm, so I was happy and didn't mind at all. He told me his name was John. He asked why I was scantily dressed without a jacket, and I started to tell him about the party and the fight I had been in with my boyfriend. He was super charming and attentive. He even laughed that he could go back and arrest him. I asked about him, and he told me about his family. He was a young dad. He had a wife, a daughter, a son, and a dog. And I told him it was like he had the perfect little family, and he laughed and said he certainly did. Then, it had sort of clicked for me to ask him if I could use his phone, but he said no because he had to save his battery. We were approaching the gas station, and he drove right past it. I politely said, "Oh, I think that's the one," but he didn't answer me. I felt sick to my stomach. My heart started pounding. I started getting choked up. My eyes started tearing up as I was looking out the windows and watching the lights behind us getting further and further away. It was hard for me to even speak, but somehow I murmured, asking if he could please turn around, and he ignored me. Whenever I would look at him, he just looked empty-eyed and emotionless, totally dead and glazed. I looked back out the window and down at the road to see if maybe we were going slow enough that I could make a leap out of the car without seriously injuring myself. I remember always hearing, "Never go to the second location," but I thought about the possibility of jumping out and breaking an ankle and how it would be a lot harder to get away with 1 foot as opposed to 2. Debating with myself that there was snow on the ground, but then again, snow is hard to get along in, especially when you're not fully clothed. I feel so dumb now because I wasn't even tied up or anything. I was just so scared though. Like there was nothing but trees, an empty road, and us. I was crying pretty badly at this point and asked if I could please borrow his phone again. I don't know why I even asked. And he told me to stop talking. Then he started talking underneath his breath, saying, "Girls shouldn't be out so late. You shouldn't have been alone this late. Look what you're doing to me. Dressed like a slut." And other derogatory things. As he kept saying these terrible things, too many to mention here, I wasn't even responding. I was just crying and trying to think past the fear I was feeling. I remembered the pair of handcuffs I remember seeing under the papers beneath my feet, so I used that little, I don't know how to describe it, like scoopy motion. I managed to use my feet to scoop the handcuffs up and used my heels and toes to push them under the bottom of my seat as far as I could. I was thinking of different things I could do to try to help myself, like if we were close enough to some upcoming lights or structures, if I ever made it to them, I could just grab the wheel and caused us to crash into them, or maybe how if I got lucky enough for a cop to pass us, I could grab the wheel and swerve so he would appear to be a drunk driver, and we get pulled over. I guiltily thought about the possibility if this man is just having a weird night, and how if I did anything, it would hurt him. But I told myself that sort of thinking sort of got me into this mess. He pulled off road where there were still woods on both sides of us. On his side, the wooded trees were closer to the road. On mine, there was a small gap, fully covered in thick, I don't know about how many feet of snow, before the trees thickly picked up maybe 10 to 16 yards away. He turned off the car and coldly said there was something wrong with the car, and to get out with him. As he grabbed the keys and was stepping out of the car, I grabbed on to the center console and cried and pleaded not to make me get out with him because it was too cold. He turned around to face me, his door still open, and shouted at me to get out of the car because we had to go check out the trunk bed hatch. I dug my fingernails deeper into the console, thinking my cries of no and head shaking would cause him to come around to my side of the car and drag me out himself. I was crying and said, "Please, John, I'm so cold and scared." I was thinking of everything I ever heard. Humanize yourself. Use first names. He stared at me in this way I can't even describe it to this day. I don't even know how to start. He got back in the car and I sinked towards my window, scared he would drag me over the console. He turned off the headlights and everything just looked dark blue. He stared at the steering wheel for what felt like years before lighting a cigarette and looking out his window and back at me and then back out his window. He heard me shuffle my feet on the newspapers. I was just adjusting my legs, but while still staring out his window, told me if I thought about running, he had a quick way to get me where he wanted me. And oddly enough, I was sort of thinking of running minutes before that, but reasoned that if he wanted me out of the car, then I should definitely stay in. Otherwise, he could chase me or shoot me, in case he had hunting rifles in the back. I didn't dare look. I'm glad I was right. I think at that point, I sort of hit some sort of bottom of my reserve, and instead of panic, there was a numbness and exhaustion. There were still an occasional hot tear or two, but I just remember being numb. I talked to a psychiatrist about this sort of thing, and he thinks it just came from my ex-boyfriends giving me PTSD. It was dead quiet, but I finally just barely audibly told him that my friend was still waiting for me, and asked about his wife and children, and he flatly said he didn't have a wife or children, and that his house was empty. I asked him what he was thinking about, and he said, "I'm thinking of what to do with you." He didn't say it angrily, he just said it flatly and coldly, which sort of scared me more. I did start getting worked up back to a cry at that point, and he told me not to cry and turned the car on, offering me some heat. I just cried and said I wanted to go home. Eventually he started driving and kept driving until we were approaching a gas station. I was gouging the right time to reach for the wheel, but before I could, he started slowing down. While pulling up, he told me not to tell anyone or he would find me. Then he told me all he was doing was teaching me a lesson not to hitchhike with strangers. He was almost coming to a complete stop when he told me to get out before he changes his mind. Before he could even get another look at me to assess my understanding, I was already down out of the truck and sprinting towards the gas station. The panic was overwhelming, but then I stopped and remembered to try to see his license plate. I turned around but only caught the blur of the last 3 numbers as he was driving off. I ran inside and asked the clerk behind the counter to please call the police. I waited until the officer got there, and I'll be honest, I was a little scared it would be John. My fears melted away when the new-faced policeman got there. I gave him the description of John, his appearance, the vehicle color and type, the parts of the license plate number I had caught, the fact he said he was an off-duty cop, just basically anything I could. I asked him if he could look at the camera, and the officer disappeared in the back for a little bit, then came back out saying there was nothing on them. I asked if I would be able to look, and the officer said no, and asked me if I didn't trust him, and I told him of course I did. The officer gave me a ride to my friends, lecturing me for hitchhiking, consisting of him repeatedly asking if I knew who Ted Bundy was. Of course I knew. I was just naive to think it could never happen to me, and I was desperate for some warmth. I never heard anything back about the report that was made, so I would try to follow up, and each time I did, they never got back to me aside from this one time I was told my case number didn't exist. But that didn't stop me from trying to follow up. Throughout the months and years, I asked my friend, whose home I had slept over that one night, if she had heard of any weirdness or anything since that incident had happened to her or anyone up there, and she always says no. So I sort of let it go and try to tell myself that maybe he actually was just trying to teach me a lesson or something. I mean, I definitely never hitchhike again, so it was a lesson. It certainly worked. I never heard anything back having to do with the case. I never heard of any other odd experiences up there. Maybe it was just one man trying to teach me something. But honestly, sometimes I think I tell myself all of that to help me sleep better at night. It all felt really real. Even if it wasn't real. I'm really glad I didn't get out of the car in the woods that night. This has also been super therapeutic to let out. So thank you so much for listening to my story. And as far as that John guy was, you've now made me afraid to ever visit the forest. I hope I never see you again. This night started in the city but ended in the deep woods. I will obscure the locations for personal safety. I'm originally from the Northeast but couldn't stand the winters, so I went south for college. I was enrolled in my first year of university in the southern part of the U.S. The university was a small city town, and going out to drink was the main thing everyone did. I was out with some other guys playing pool at a small dive bar. An older guy came up, started talking to us, and asked if he could get in on the game. I'll refer to him as Brian. I was 22 then, and he looked a bit older, probably late 30s. We played a few games, and he commented about a bonfire party happening outside of town. He mentioned there were some girls he worked with hosting it and asked if we wanted to go. My friends declined, but I was single, so I said sure. As we left the parking lot in his truck, he said we needed to swing by his apartment and grab some liquor. This is when things go weird. I remember getting in the car, pulling out of the parking lot, and then pulling up to an apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The bar was in the downtown area, and we were far away now on the outskirts of town. I wondered if I nodded off on the ride because I don't remember the drive. I started questioning myself when he said he would go inside, get the booze, take a shower, and change his clothes. He offered for me to come inside too. The inside of his apartment was empty. No furniture, nothing is hanging on the walls, just open and empty rooms. He didn't say anything about it, so I asked if he had just moved in. He said yeah and walked back to the bedroom without saying anything else. I thought about just leaving when I heard him get in the shower. Something about the situation was starting to creep me out. I was sizing him up in my head and thought I could take him if some weird shit went down. I remembered him mentioning the girls and the bonfire, so I decided to hang around and see where the night went. The shower stopped and he walked out wearing different clothes a few minutes later. He had 2 bottles of whiskey and he just looked at me and said, "Ready?" We jumped back in his truck and pulled out. I made a conscious effort to stay awake and alert. We left the city limits and headed outside town on a dark back road. We were still on the main road, but we were far from town now, and the closest city I knew of was an hour away in the opposite direction. There were fewer and fewer houses as we drove, and the places I could see looked like decrepit old shacks. I had lived here for a couple of months, but had never been out this way. We drove for a while, and I asked a few times if he knew where he was going. It was the middle of nowhere now. I didn't see any houses, and it was just thick woods on each side of the road. I didn't see him reading off of any directions or anything. I just saw a small parking lot with a gas station and a turnoff. A lone streetlight lit the gas station, only 2 pumps, and they looked ancient. A red neon sign said 24 hours. The building was a double-wide trailer converted into a store. We turned off onto the side street and kept driving. This road was even worse than the main road we were just on. There were no streetlights, and it was very narrow. It twisted and turned, just snaking through the woods. No houses were visible, but I would see an old mailbox every once in a while. We came to the top of a hill, and there was a driveway. I asked again if he knew where he was going, and he just chuckled. I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods with some dude I didn't know. Fear started to creep in. It wasn't at a house. It looked more like a garage or industrial building. There were no lights inside or around it. No motion lights as we drove up. No other cars or people. "Where is the bonfire?" I made my tone as direct as possible. He just said, "Back through the woods." We drove past the building around the back towards the woods. As we got closer, I could see it was a small path. As we went through, branches scraped along the truck's side. After what seemed like forever, the trail opened into a clearing, and I could see a few other trucks and people. Relief washed over me. I grew up in the city and wasn't used to shit like this, and I started to think I was just being uptight and needed to chill out. It was past midnight, and we left the bar around 10, so it felt good to get out of the truck. I scanned the group but could only see a few girls. A couple of guys were building a fire and trying to get it going. There were 25 or 30 people there. A guy who was introduced as Mike walked up to us to greet Brian, but he was staring at me the whole time. He never once stopped staring at me. Brian said he needed to take a piss and walked off, and Mike asked if I wanted a beer. He said to hang tight and walked away. Mike came back and handed me an open bottle. I said thanks and started to make small talk, but he just turned and walked away. I started to look around and something just seemed off. There was no music playing, no lights, no liveliness to the conversations. The people at this party seemed diverse in age, and I wondered how everyone knew each other. No one was talking. They were all just standing together in small groups and mumbling. Each time I approached a group of people, they would all stop talking and stare at me. It was standoffish and uncomfortable. I found myself standing alone and just looking around for Brian. I couldn't see him anywhere. I looked around for his truck, but didn't see it. I had had enough of this weird shit and was ready to go. I kept scanning around, looking for his truck, but it wasn't there. I didn't hear any vehicle start up or come and go while I was walking around. I turned back towards the bonfire and saw everyone looking at me together. All 30 or so people were now in one grouping, and they just stood there. No talking or movement. They were standing there completely still and just staring at me. The bonfire glowed behind the group, making the moment feel surreal. I stood there awkwardly and started noticing that their faces were changing. Their expressions rapidly changed from smiling to frowning, to mouths and eyes wide and snarling grimaces. But as I focused on one to see if that was what was really happening, the face would appear blank and expressionless. Suddenly, one of the men started walking towards me at a deliberate pace. I turned and just ran. I ran up the path out of the clearing as fast as I could. My adrenaline was surging, and I kept running. I couldn't hear anyone coming up behind me or any vehicles, but I knew I couldn't stop and needed to put as much distance as possible between them and me. I started to panic as the trail broke off and went different ways. I didn't remember that from driving in, but I kept running. Finally, I saw the building through the trees and felt some relief. I stopped just before the edge of the trail. It was late fall and brisk, but I was burning up. I was wearing a flannel and jeans with boots, not very good for running. I was sweating like a pig and needed to catch my breath. I couldn't hear anyone coming up behind me on the path or hear any vehicles in the distance. The light from the bonfire wasn't visible anymore through the thick woods. As I crossed the lot and passed the industrial building toward the paved road, lights came on inside. A second wind of adrenaline took hold, and I ran toward the paved road and kept running. My feet felt like lead and my legs burned, but I kept running as long as possible. I finally got tired and moved off the paved road into the brush to hide and catch my breath. I didn't see any headlights, so I went back to the side of the road and began jogging. I was on high alert and kept glancing behind me, but I never saw anything. I finally reached the end of the road, which connected back to the main road and the gas station. I went inside, and an old guy sat at the counter watching a small TV. He asked if I was all right, and I said I needed to use a phone. He laughed and said, "Where did you come from?" "I was out at a party and got ditched." He laughed a little and gestured towards the phone on the wall. I could see he had a gun on his hip and probably thought I was a tweaker coming to rob him. There was a phone book by the phone, and I called a taxi to pick me up. An hour later, I was back in my dorm and went to sleep. I never saw Brian again. I drove past his apartment complex, but never saw his truck parked there. I never saw it around town or back at the bar either. I remember it was an off-white single-cab Chevy, late 80s model with a skull sticker on the back window with Roman numerals on the forehead. My curiosity got the best of me a few times, and I drove toward the small gas station. I followed the road to where the shop was and found it. I drove out a couple times, and each time there was no one there, and no cars in the lot. The building looked even shittier in the daylight. I left and drove back to town. This happened in fall of 2004. And I still get creeped out by it. To this day, I really hope I never see Brian or any of those other people again. And this, dear listeners, is the end of true Backwoods creepy stories. I hope that you all enjoyed and that you are resting peacefully. Until next time, I will read to you soon. Good night.